So today we're talking about ratios and proportions. Ratios are just fractions, pretty much, and proportions, they'll look like fractions equal to each other, and the fractions can be reduced or changed so that they are equivalent or equal. Now, all the questions that we are doing today, there are multiple ways to do it. So if you go through today and you're like, I know a different way to do this and I want to do it my way, that is perfectly fine. You don't have to do it this way if you don't want to. Whatever you feel comfortable with is fine. So the first two questions, we're just determining if each pair of fractions would be equivalent, so equal. Now, one way to do this is to take 6/10 and reduce it. So we could divide both numbers by 2 to get 3/5. So now 3/5 and 2/5, they have the same denominator, so we can easily compare them. These would not be equivalent because they are not equal, so this would be no. Another way you could do it is change 2/5 to having a denominator of 10. So multiplying the top and bottom by 2 to get 4/10. So again, we see not equal. And a third way to do this is called cross multiplying. So you multiply what's diagonal from each other. So 6 times 5 is 30, 2 times 10 is 20, and 20 is not equal to 30. So all three ways show us that they are not equivalent. Sometimes there won't be a fraction that you can reduce, like 6/10, or it'll take a bit of work to get a common denominator. So I prefer the cross multiplying way because it's the same steps every single time, and it's pretty easy to set up. So number 2, we're figuring out if these are equivalent. So you could reduce 5 over 30, divide both by 5 to get 1/6. So 1/6 and 1/6, we can say yes, those are equivalent. And again, you could have changed 1/6 to 5 over 30. You could have cross multiplied. So if you cross multiplied, it would look like this. 1 times 30 is 30. 5 times 6 is 30, and those are equal. I am going to be using the cross multiply method for our next 5 problems. But again, if you know a way that you prefer better, feel free to use that way. So for number 1, I'm going to cross multiply. So 5 times x is 5x, and 3 times 10. I know 3 times 10 is 30. And then divide both sides by 5 to get x equals 6. So you also could notice, well, 5 divided by 2 is 10, so what divided by 2 is 3? We know that that's 6. So again, different ways, just choose whatever you prefer. But 2 and 3, they're a little bit harder, so I wanted to show you the cross multiply method for number 1, even though it was an easier one. So number 2, I'm doing 7 times x minus 2, so that x minus 2 is going to be in parentheses because I need to multiply that 7 by each term. Then 2 times 14. I'm going to use the distributive property to get 7x minus 14 equals 2 times 14 is 28. Add 14 to both sides to get 7x equals 42. Divide both sides by 7 to get x equals 6. And you can always check that. If you plug 6 in, we get 6 minus 2 is 4, and 4 over 14 does reduce down to 2 over 7. Number 3, cross multiply to get 8 times x plus 4 equals 3 times 5. Use the distributive property to get 8x plus 32 equals 15. Subtract 32 from both sides to get 8x equals 15 minus 32 is negative 17. Then divide both sides by 8 to get x equals negative 17 over 8. You could also rewrite this as negative 2 and 1/8, or you could also write it as a decimal. I don't care which way you write it, but in algebra, like I've said before, we will oftentimes want to keep it as improper form because it will eventually be easier for us to solve more things with those answers. So just keep that kind of in the back of your mind. Now numbers 4 and 5, they will be proportions, and I will tell you why here in a moment. But I'm going to show you how to solve it by setting up a proportion like what we see for numbers 1, 2, and 3. But again, there are different ways to solve these. So if you see a different way that would be your first instinct to solve it, that is perfectly fine. You can do it your way. So number 4, I want to read through it. In the past 2 years, a retailer has opened 232 stores. If the rate of growth remains constant, how many stores will the retailer open in the next 3 years? So the word that tells me if this is a proportion is that it's a rate that is constant. Anytime you have a constant rate, it means it's growing like the same amount every time. So this would be a proportion. So that key word was constant. Now to set up your proportion, I always start with the very first number that they gave us, which was 2 years. And it's very important to write your label for these 2 years. The very next number they gave me was 232 stores, so that's going to go next. And then the only other number they told me is 3 years. You're going to put 3 years on the top of this fraction. The reason is because we want the labels to match. So I'd write a note to yourself, match the labels. Oops. So whatever label you put on top needs to stay on top. Whatever label you put on bottom needs to stay on bottom. That's why I like to actually put the labels in my work. And then I need a variable here. Some people would choose S, but S looks like a 5, so I'm just going to choose N. And anytime we have a story problem where we're picking a variable, we need to say what that variable stands for. So N is going to stand for the number of stores. And then once I have the proportion set up, I can solve it. So 2 times N is 2N. And then I have 3 times 232. So we get 2N equals 3 times 232 is 696. Divide both sides by 2 to get N equals 348. Now since this was a star problem, I need to look back. Okay, if N equals 348, N stood for number of stores, so it's 348 stores. Now some other people, they notice, well, you could have just done 232 divided by 2 and then multiply it by 3. That is perfectly fine. You still get 348. So if you read this problem and your first instinct was to do 232 divided by 2, then times 3, that's perfectly fine. I just wanted to show you another way to set it up in case if you ever get stuck, you know what to look for. Number 5, in a road atlas, the scale for the map of Connecticut is 5 inches equals 41 miles. What is the distance in miles represented by 2.5 inches on the map? So our keyword here is scale. Anytime we see the word scale, we can set up a proportion. And if there's a scale, your scale is going to be your first fraction. So they're saying 5 inches is equivalent to 41 miles, so I'm going to put 5 inches over 41 miles. And then the only other number I know is 2.5 inches. Since I had inches on top originally, I'm going to keep it on top. And then I don't know the number of miles, so I'm going to use M and then say M stands for miles. Now you could change 2.5 to 2.5 if you want, if you prefer to work with decimals rather than fractions. I'm going to keep it as a fraction, but you can change it if you want. So I'm going to cross multiply to get 5m equals 41 times 2.5. So off to the side, I'm going to figure out what is 41 times 2.5. So I'm going to write 41 is 41 over 1. I'm going to multiply it by 2.5. I'm going to turn that into an improper fraction. So 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5 over 2. So 41 times 5 is 205. 1 times 2 is 2. And again, you could turn this into a fraction or into a decimal if you want. That is completely up to you. Now I need to get rid of this 5, so I'm going to divide both sides by 5. Okay, m equals, now I'm going to do this off to the side again. This says 205 over 2 divided by 5. So I'm going to keep the first fraction, change division to multiplication. I'm going to flip the second fraction. So that was 5 over 1 is now 1 over 5. 205 times 1 is 205. 2 times 10, or 2 times 5 is 10. Okay, so since this is a story problem, I would like to see it as either a mixed number or a decimal. So I'm going to divide this. 10 goes into 22 times. 10 doesn't go into 5. Okay, so I have a remainder of 5, so that's going to be my numerator. 10 is my denominator because that's what I divided by. So 5 over 10 is 1/2. So my answer is 20 and a half, and M stood for miles. You could also have 20.5. Okay, so again, with this one, you could have also have done 41 divided by 5, and then take that number, multiply that by 2.5. So whatever way you would instinctively do it that way. I'm just showing you this way so that you have another way or another option to do it. And so if you see those key words like scale or constant or proportion, then you know you can set it up like this and solve it. If you got to a problem you're like, I have no idea what to do, you can look for those words. So if you have any questions, please email me.